Most people think cutting a toxic person out of their life is the ultimate victory. It sounds strong, decisive, and emotionally healthy. But what if, in many situations, it actually gives them exactly what they want? What if your sudden disappearance becomes another story they use to paint themselves as the victim while quietly maintaining control over your emotions? Here's something almost nobody realizes. Toxic people don't fear distance as much as they fear losing influence. There's a huge psychological difference between someone leaving because they were rejected and someone leaving because their tactics simply stopped working. That difference changes everything. Have you ever noticed how some difficult people seem strangely calm when they're dramatically cut off, yet become increasingly uncomfortable when they're treated with quiet confidence and emotional neutrality? That's not a coincidence. It's human psychology. By the end of this video, you'll understand why trying to win against toxic people often keeps you emotionally tied to them, while a completely different approach naturally encourages them to walk away on their own. You'll learn how emotional investment fuels manipulation, why healthy boundaries are far more powerful than emotional reactions, and how confident behavior quietly shifts the balance of every relationship. One of the biggest misunderstandings about toxic relationships is believing that your physical presence is what gives a toxic person power. In reality, what they're often seeking is your emotional investment. Whether it's your frustration, your need to explain yourself, your guilt, or even your attempts to fix the relationship, every strong emotional reaction tells them they still have influence over your inner world. Human behavior follows a simple pattern. People continue using strategies that consistently produce results. If manipulation keeps getting emotional responses, the manipulation is reinforced. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to create conflict over the smallest issues? It's rarely about the issue itself. The disagreement becomes a tool for measuring how much control they still have. Every defensive explanation, every emotional argument, and every desperate attempt to be understood becomes proof that they can still shape your behavior. Here's what most people completely miss. The goal isn't to become cold or indifferent toward everyone. Emotional intelligence means learning where your emotional energy deserves to go. Healthy relationships thrive on honest communication, while toxic relationships often survive on emotional chaos. When you stop feeding that chaos, the relationship begins to lose the very thing keeping it alive. Imagine a coworker who constantly criticizes your ideas during meetings. In the past, you defended every point, stayed awake replaying the conversation, and tried harder to earn their approval. Then one day you calmly acknowledge their opinion without arguing, continue contributing confidently, and refuse to carry the conflict home with you. Over time, they notice something unexpected. Their usual strategy no longer creates the reaction they expected. The dynamic begins to shift because you've stopped rewarding the behavior. This doesn't mean allowing disrespect or accepting mistreatment. It means replacing emotional reactivity with intentional boundaries. Confidence isn't about winning every confrontation. It's about deciding which interactions deserve your attention and which don't. When your emotional state is no longer controlled by someone else's behavior, you've already begun changing the relationship without saying a word. But here's where it gets interesting. If emotional reactions are the fuel toxic people rely on, what happens when they encounter someone whose boundaries are so consistent that manipulation simply stops working? That's exactly what we'll explore next. Here's something that surprises many people. Toxic individuals rarely abandon manipulation because they suddenly develop empathy. More often, they stop because the behavior no longer produces a worthwhile return. Human beings naturally conserve effort. If a strategy repeatedly fails, most people, whether consciously or unconsciously, begin looking for a different target or a different approach. This is where consistent boundaries become incredibly powerful. A boundary isn't a threat, an ultimatum, or a dramatic speech. It's a predictable pattern of behavior. It says, this is how I respond every single time, regardless of how someone else feels about it. That consistency removes uncertainty, and uncertainty is often where manipulation finds room to grow. Hey, have you ever noticed how some people keep testing limits, almost as if they're waiting for you to make an exception? That's because inconsistent boundaries teach them that persistence eventually pays off. If you ignore 10 disrespectful comments but react to the 11th, you've unintentionally trained them to keep trying. They learn that enough pressure will eventually break your resolve. But here's where it gets interesting. Emotional intelligence isn't just about understanding other people. It's about understanding yourself. Many people struggle with boundaries because they confuse kindness with availability. They worry that saying no will make them seem selfish, uncaring, or difficult. Toxic people often recognize this psychological blind spot and quietly exploit it. They know that guilt can be a stronger motivator than fear. Imagine a friend who only calls when they need a favor. Every conversation begins warmly, but it always ends with another request. In the past, you rearranged your schedule because you didn't want to disappoint them. Eventually, you decide on a simple rule. If helping genuinely works for you, you say yes. If it doesn't, you politely decline without offering lengthy explanations or apologies. At first, they push back. They question your loyalty, remind you of past favors, or act disappointed. But you respond with the same calm consistency every time. Something fascinating begins to happen. They realize there's no emotional opening to exploit, no argument to win, no guilt to amplify, no dramatic conversation to pull you into. Your behavior becomes predictable, and because manipulation depends on unpredictability and emotional leverage, its effectiveness starts to disappear. This changes the relationship in a subtle but important way. Instead of forcing someone out of your life, you quietly remove the rewards that kept unhealthy behavior alive. Some people will adapt and begin treating you with greater respect. Others won't. Those who only valued access to your emotional energy often lose interest because the relationship no longer serves the purpose they were seeking. Watch what happens next, because this is where many people make a critical mistake. Once toxic behavior stops working, it often doesn't disappear immediately, evolves. Understanding that next phase can prevent you from falling back into the same cycle, just in a different form. One of the most important psychological patterns to recognize is that manipulation rarely disappears the moment you establish healthy boundaries. Instead, it often changes form. This is where many people become confused. They assume the situation has improved because the obvious arguments have stopped, when in reality, the tactics have simply become more subtle. Human behavior is remarkably adaptive. When one strategy no longer works, people naturally experiment with another. A toxic person who can no longer provoke anger may begin seeking sympathy. If guilt no longer influences you, they may suddenly become unusually kind. If criticism fails, they might switch to silence, hoping uncertainty will make you chase their approval again. The objective hasn't changed, only the method has. Have you ever noticed someone who seems to become the perfect person immediately after realizing they're losing influence? They apologize, promise change, shower you with compliments, or suddenly remember everything you've wanted to hear for months. At first, it feels like genuine growth. Sometimes it truly is. But here's what most people completely miss. Lasting change isn't measured by emotional moments. It's measured by consistent behavior over time. This is where self-awareness becomes your greatest advantage. Instead of asking, do they sound sincere? Ask yourself, are their actions consistently different, even when they don't get immediate rewards? Anyone can behave differently for a few days or even a few weeks. Sustainable change shows up in repeated actions, especially when life becomes stressful again. Imagine a partner who constantly ignored your opinions until you finally stopped arguing and focused on your own peace. Suddenly, they become incredibly attentive. They send thoughtful messages, compliment you, and promise they'll never repeat the past. While that may be encouraging, you don't rush to trust the words alone. You observe the pattern. Weeks later, when a disagreement arises, do they still communicate respectfully? Do they take responsibility without blaming you, or do they slip back into the same behaviors once they feel secure again? The answer tells you far more than any apology ever could. Almost nobody realizes that confidence isn't about refusing second chances. It's about refusing to ignore repeated patterns. Trust is built through consistency, not emotion. Healthy relationships grow because both people are willing to adjust their behavior, not because one person becomes endlessly patient while the other remains unchanged. By staying calm and observing patterns instead of reacting to promises, you quietly shift the balance of influence. You're no longer making decisions based on hope, guilt, or temporary emotions. You're making them based on evidence. And when someone realizes that emotional performances no longer persuade you, they face a choice: genuinely grow or gradually walk away because the old strategies no longer work. But here's where the psychology becomes even more fascinating. Why do some toxic people eventually leave on their own instead of continuing the fight? The answer lies in one of the strongest emotional triggers in human behavior: the desire for effortless control. That's exactly what we'll uncover in the next keynote. One of the greatest misconceptions about toxic relationships is believing that the other person is endlessly committed to you. In many cases, they're actually committed to something much simpler: the ease of controlling the relationship. When that control requires increasing effort with decreasing results, the psychological reward begins to disappear. Human behavior naturally follows efficiency. People invest their energy where they believe they'll get the biggest emotional return. This explains why some toxic individuals suddenly seem less interested once you've developed genuine emotional stability. It's not because you've become cold or unreachable. It's because you've become predictable in the healthiest possible way. You no longer react impulsively to criticism. You don't chase after periods of silence. You don't feel compelled to defend every misunderstanding. Without those emotional openings, manipulation becomes exhausting rather than rewarding. Have you ever noticed how some people become increasingly dramatic when their usual influence stops working? They may create unnecessary crises, spread rumors, bring up old mistakes, or even recruit mutual friends into the conflict. At first glance, it looks like they're becoming more powerful. In reality, it's often a sign that they're becoming more desperate. When simple methods fail, they escalate because they're hoping anything, will restore the old dynamic. But here's where it gets interesting. Escalation is often the final test. Many people interpret it as proof that their boundaries aren't working, so they abandon them at the exact moment they're becoming effective. The toxic cycle begins all over again because the manipulator learns that enough pressure eventually breaks resistance. Imagine a family member who has always used guilt to influence your decisions. Every holiday becomes an emotional negotiation. If you can't attend an event, they accuse you of not caring about the family. In the past, you would spend hours explaining yourself, apologizing repeatedly, and changing your plans just to restore peace. This time you respond respectfully but firmly. You explain your decision once, wish everyone well, and refuse to revisit the conversation every time they bring it up. At first, the pressure increases. They may call more often, involve other relatives, or remind you of everything they've done for you over the years. Instead of reacting emotionally, you remain calm and consistent. You continue treating them with respect, but you don't negotiate your boundary. After several unsuccessful attempts, something begins to change. The emotional payoff they've relied on for years simply isn't there anymore. Almost nobody realizes that confidence is often quiet. It doesn't announce itself through arguments or dramatic exits. It appears through emotional consistency. Your body language becomes more relaxed. Your voice remains steady under pressure. You stop seeking permission to make healthy decisions. That quiet confidence communicates something words never can. My emotional well-being is no longer available for negotiation. This changes the entire relationship dynamic. Some people recognize the new reality and choose to build a healthier relationship with you. Others gradually distance themselves because the connection no longer provides the control they once enjoyed. You didn't force them out. You simply stopped making a manipulation easy. But here's the psychological blind spot many people still struggle with. Even after someone begins pulling away, they often feel guilty, wondering if they've become selfish or uncaring. Understanding the difference between healthy compassion and unhealthy responsibility is what finally sets you free. And that's exactly where we're going next. One of the deepest psychological traps in toxic relationships is believing you're responsible for another person's emotional state. This belief doesn't usually appear overnight. It develops gradually through repeated experiences where you're made to feel that their anger is your fault, their disappointment is your responsibility, or their happiness depends entirely on your behavior. Over time, you stop asking, is this actually my responsibility? And start asking, what do I need to do to keep the peace? Here's what most people completely miss. Healthy relationships involve shared responsibility, while toxic relationships often involve one-sided emotional labor. One person constantly adjusts, apologizes, explains, and compromises, while the other rarely reflects on their own behavior. The imbalance becomes so normal that you begin confusing self-sacrifice with love. Hey, have you ever noticed how some people react as though your healthy boundary is a personal attack? They might say you've changed, become selfish, or no longer care about them. These statements can trigger guilt because they challenge your identity as a kind and caring person. But emotional intelligence teaches us an important distinction. Someone feeling disappointed doesn't automatically mean you've done something wrong. Think about a relationship where every disagreement ended the same way. You apologized just to end the conflict, even when you weren't at fault. You believed keeping the relationship together was more important than addressing the unhealthy pattern. Eventually, you realize something surprising. Every unnecessary apology reinforced the belief that you would always carry the emotional burden. The cycle wasn't continuing because you lacked kindness. It was continuing because the pattern rewarded unhealthy behavior. Imagine an employee with a demanding manager who expects them to answer messages late at night, cancel personal plans, and remain constantly available. At first, the employee complies because they want to be seen as dependable. But months later, stress and exhaustion begin affecting every part of life. They finally establish a respectful boundary by responding during work hours unless there's a genuine emergency. The manager initially expresses frustration, suggesting they're no longer committed. Instead of reacting defensively, the employee calmly continues producing high-quality work while maintaining the new boundary. After a while, the complaints lose momentum because the expected guilt no longer changes the employee's behavior. This changes everything. True confidence isn't proving you're willing to sacrifice yourself for every relationship. It's recognizing that respect must exist on both sides. Compassion doesn't require abandoning your own well-being. In fact, the healthiest relationships are built when both people are responsible for managing their own emotions instead of placing that responsibility on someone else. Almost nobody realizes that letting go of unnecessary guilt creates space for something much more valuable: clarity. You begin seeing people as they truly are, rather than through the lens of obligation. You stop measuring relationships by how much you've endured and start measuring them by mutual respect, trust, and emotional safety. And once you reach that level of self awareness, something remarkable happens. You no longer focus on making toxic people leave. Whether they stay or go becomes far less important because your peace is no longer dependent on their choices. That's the final lesson we'll explore in our last keynote, where everything comes together. By this point, you may have noticed something surprising. This entire conversation was never really about changing toxic people. It was about changing the relationship dynamic. That's an important distinction because one is outside your control, while the other is completely within it. Many people spend years searching for the perfect words to make a manipulative person understand the pain they've caused. They rehearse conversations in their minds, hoping that if they explain themselves just one more time, the other person will suddenly gain empathy. But human behavior doesn't usually change because of a brilliant argument. It changes when the environment that rewarded unhealthy behavior no longer exists. Have you ever noticed how confident people rarely seem obsessed with proving they're right? That's because their confidence comes from self-awareness, not from winning every disagreement. They understand that not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected, not every criticism deserves a response, and not every relationship is meant to last forever. Here's where everything comes together. When you stop reacting impulsively, establish consistent boundaries, observe behavioral patterns instead of empty promises, refuse to carry emotional responsibilities that belong to someone else, and protect your peace without becoming hostile, you quietly become someone who is very difficult to manipulate. Imagine two people facing the exact same toxic individual. The first argues, defends, over-explains, and constantly seeks validation. Every interaction becomes emotionally exhausting because they're trying to change someone who doesn't want to change. The second person remains respectful but grounded. They communicate clearly, keep their boundaries consistent, and refuse to participate in emotional games. They don't chase approval, and they don't seek revenge. Over time, the toxic person naturally invests less energy in the second relationship because the emotional reward has disappeared. Almost nobody realizes that this isn't about making someone lose. It's about making manipulation irrelevant. When unhealthy behavior no longer produces attention, guilt, fear, or emotional chaos, it begins to lose its purpose. Some people may choose to grow because they recognize the relationship has fundamentally changed. Others may gradually distance themselves in search of easier opportunities to repeat old patterns. Either outcome gives you something far more valuable than victory. It gives you peace. This also transforms your body language and communication in ways you may not even notice. You speak more calmly because you're no longer trying to convince everyone. Your posture becomes more relaxed because you're not carrying the weight of other people's emotions. Your decisions become clearer because they're guided by your values instead of your fears. Confidence stops being something you perform and becomes something you naturally communicate. But perhaps the biggest psychological blind spot is believing that protecting yourself requires becoming cold or distrustful. It doesn't. Emotional intelligence means staying open to healthy relationships while recognizing unhealthy patterns sooner. You can remain compassionate without becoming naive. You can forgive without reopening doors that repeatedly harmed your well-being. And you can care about people without making their emotional stability your responsibility. The real lesson isn't never cut off toxic people as a rule. There are situations, especially involving abuse, threats, or danger, where ending contact is the healthiest and safest choice. The deeper principle is this: don't let your decisions be driven by anger, revenge, or the need to prove a point. Let them be guided by clarity, self respect, and emotional wisdom. Whether someone stays or leaves should be a consequence of healthy boundaries, not the objective itself. As you move forward, start observing people more carefully than you judge them. Notice their patterns instead of their promises. Pay attention to how they respond when you calmly say no. Watch whether they respect your boundaries when there's nothing in it for them. Those small moments reveal far more about character than grand declarations ever will. The more you understand human behavior, the less you'll feel the need to control it. And the more you develop self-awareness, emotional intelligence, and quiet confidence, the more you'll attract relationships built on mutual respect instead of emotional dependence. That's not just a healthier way to live, it's a more peaceful one. If you enjoyed this video and want to learn more about relationship psychology, human behavior, and communication, make sure to subscribe, like this video, and turn on notifications so you never miss our future content.